panelists for their statements. We'll begin the questions. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Play the scenario out hypothetically, if you can. And I know it's a hypothetical and it's based on your expertise, but down the road, as Mr. Tabler says, it's going to be eventually somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. You got two terrorist groups on each side. Entire region is unstable because of what's taking place in Syria. So, assume Assad wins and is able to run the rebels out. How does that play out? Assume he loses. The rebel groups take over. Is there civil war? Just kind of look into the future if you can for me. And I'll ask that question to all four of you. Mr. Jenkins?
It's a great question. I don't see one side prevailing in this conflict. I mean, in terms of, as I say, even if Assad were to fall, the fighting were to continue. Assad's growing power is not going to be able to, in the foreseeable future, reassert his authority throughout the country. And so I think the premise has to be one of continuing conflict among a kaleidoscope of ethnic and sectarian groups in Syria that could go on for many, many years, and that's really the premise. In that kind of a scenario, the United States, without significant investment, is really at the margin. And so the question becomes not one of whether we can back Assad or back the rebels against him, but rather what can we do within that kind of environment to meet the objectives that Mr. Tabler has identified in the country. What can we do to best serve our interest in a continuing conflict? And even raise the broader question, although it may sound cynical, is there I know we naturally as Americans want to get to post-war on this, but given the nature of the conflict, can we get there? And is it absolutely vital to U.S. interest that we try to end the fighting in Syria, or we simply accept that it will continue and try to contain it and as I say, live with this thing as it is, as these jihadists and Hezbollah and others tear each other up inside of the country once known as Syria?
Thank you. I'm going to change the question because I'm running out of time. Try to make your answers shorter if you can. Terrorist groups and their influence in neighboring countries, whether it's the Assad regime or the rebel groups, their effect on neighbors, Jordan, Lebanon, and even Israel. So, Mr. Smythe, I'll just ask you that question. How do you see that? What's taking place? What's the direction of those groups?
Well, the direction, in particular, if you want to focus on the Iranian-backed organizations, they are becoming an extremely professional force, and they're very, very tough. We now have units that could, directly attack Israeli interests, American interests, Saudi interests, and they're building their power up in Syria. This is kind of like their training ground in many ways. In fact, Lebanese Hezbollah was sending its reserve troops into Syria so that they could essentially train and gain combat skills. And where do you think they're going to send them afterwards? They're likely going to send them to South Lebanon. That's usually where they put more of their trained men. Often they send them other places to create new Iranian proxy organizations. In terms of these other groups, Salafi jihadi groups, Sunni organizations, they too are gaining valuable combat experience. And since, both, it's interesting kind of trying to outline this. Iran has its own Islamic revolutionary ideology, and it is a global ideology. They really do, believe in this kind of messianic future. The same thing goes for these Sunni jihadists. and they're all trying to get to that end. You now have two radical forms of Islamism fighting each other, and this doesn't mean necessarily that they are going to stop fighting Western interests or any of their other enemies in the area.
All right, my time has expired. I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Sherman from California, for 5 minutes.